they've set up the office of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex
Yes.
rather than calling it Archwell. You know, they still call themselves Archwell's the charitable foundation kind of side of things, but everything from them now is the office of.
Yes.
They've got their own coat of arms, and now they're going on a tour. We have the potential for, and we're talking medieval history or talking back in the past.
The rival king.
We've got a kind of rival Montecito household out there.
Yes, you do. To all intents and purposes, that is a very real possibility. The problem for them, for the Sussexes, is that once you start doing anything like that, people become a lot more critical of what you do outside that. So things like commercial endeavours or quasi-royal tours, people put it under more of a microscope than they would if you were calling it simply the office of Harry and Meghan. It's interesting. I wonder, is it part of an attempt to pivot from, really some harsh headlines they've had in the last year or two? Is it maybe to go in a slightly more socially conservative direction and have themselves as sort of royals in exile, for want of a better word? I wonder, is that them acting on advice that people don't want to hear another interview or another criticism of the British royal family? So it's possible.
Well, it seemed to fit the royal blueprint, had all the hallmarks of tours that I've seen in the past, or definitely with Harry and Meghan when they were in South Africa and Australia. It kind of ticked all the boxes, and I wonder if, we don't know yet, but I just wonder if they must have plans for, if as you say, it was a success, they must have plans. They could do this in America. They could do, a tour of certain areas of America or other parts of Africa or Asia. Anyway.
Certainly, I mean, their popularity in America is pretty low at the minute. Right. That could change. Yeah. As I think public opinion, you always have to assume it's a bit of a roller coaster. But they absolutely could, and I think there's indicators that they will, to be honest, Matt, because you heard, them talk about what a great success it was for them. And they, obviously Archwell had some pretty negative headlines that weekend as well. So I think that, for them, the tours are probably something very welcome, and it does remind them and their supporters and sympathisers of that kind of star potential that Harry and Meghan had when they first started stepping out onto foreign tours. So I really would not be surprised if we saw more of these. The difficulty for them down the line, and not just for them, but specifically in this case them, will be if there are more and more quasi-official tours, the question of who pays for it will become trickier, and then they'll start to put her, as they do with all royal wives and royal women, the wardrobe will go under the microscope. There'll be the headlines will start to generate themselves. That's not to say that they shouldn't do it, but I do think that they will get a different kind of press coverage, a lot of it more positive.
One person we've not seen for a while is the Princess of Wales.
Yes.
Obviously, always on the show, which we send her our best. Where does you think she stands, like on the kind of historical arc that I keep referring to? Is there anyone in the past that we look back, or past or present or future or whatever, we look back and think the Princess of Wales has similarity in qualities or post or position?
Yeah, I mean, one of the few, when I really started out years ago, one of the things I sort of feel, thank goodness I got in there with an early prediction, is that I do think the Princess of Wales is very like the late Queen Mother, and maybe not necessarily in personality, but in terms of both of them. I mean, we forget, I think, that the Queen Mother's been dead, 22 years. But the Queen Mother, in her lifetime, was an extraordinarily popular figure. I mean, even into the 1990s, she was outpolling Diana, sometimes as the nation's favourite royal. I remember when I worked in a biography of her, an American friend said, I don't think the Brits know that she died in such debt. And I said, no, they do know, just no one cared. They sort of just, it was, she was hugely, hugely popular. And part of the secret that she had was that she sees it as a marathon, not a sprint. And I do think Kate has that very clear long-term vision of, you don't sweat the everyday. You plan 5, 10, 15 years. And you don't really let yourself get dragged in too easily by the smaller details or the headlines every week. And that, as you say, is trickier in today's society than it would have been for the Queen Mother to do. But I also think the Princess of Wales is, I think she's tough in the best way possible. I use that as a compliment in the way I do with the Queen Mother. I think you have to be someone who is prepared to keep, to protect your private life, which the Queen Mother very much did with her husband and her two daughters, and also kind of keep putting one foot in front of the other and just keep going. So that, to me, is probably who I would compare it to. And actually, when I did the book on the Queen Mother, one of the people I interviewed who'd worked for the Queen Mum said they see very clear similarities between the two of them. And I think you kind of see a little bit of that in the way we've spun the Catherine versus Meghan rivalry as sort of like Elizabeth versus Wallis 2.0. It's
right.
We've sort of slotted them back in.
When you say Elizabeth, you mean the Queen
Mother? The Queen Mother, sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, and that's not to say that the comparison is justified. I always sort of defend Meghan a bit and say, she's not doing.
Well, come on, this is pesky. We might as well get into it. if the Queen Mother, Elizabeth, is
Catherine,
is Catherine, Princess of Wales.
Yep.
She obviously was married to George the Sixth, and Edward the Eighth had abdicated over
his American socialite wife. Yes,
his American socialite. Does that make? There have always been similarities between Meghan and because they're American divorcees and they've kind of broken up a part of the royal family. Do you think it's justifiable that?
Well, allegedly Prince Philip made the comparison, and he had met Wallis. One of the things that the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Edward and Wallis, did in the 1930s and again a little bit in the 1940s and 1950s is they did these very controversial quasi-royal, not royal tours.
Right. Oh, really?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. And I would have to be very, very clear before we go further. One of them was to Nazi Germany, and I am not drawing the comparison there. That's the most infamous one for very obvious reasons, because they were photographed smiling with Hitler.
Oh, yeah.
But there were other ones. They were sort of wined and dined. Again, this isn't great by Franco, but they did a couple of things in America, like you've been talking about with the Sussexes. They did have tours that aren't tours, that sort of rub the royal family up the wrong way, separating the German and the Spanish ones, which of the Spanish stay he had, because they were obviously much more politically incendiary. I think Wallis Simpson has two kinds of personalities depending on which author you're listening to.
Right.
And in many ways are the two that we ascribe to Meghan. So separating the politics for a minute, Wallis is either presented as someone who was ambitious, loathed her sister-in-law, wanted to be the star player in the monarchy, was very, very difficult to work for, and essentially moved Edward away from being a working member of the royal family. The alternative view of her is that she was someone who never fully understood the monarchy and in many ways was sort of quite badly burned by it and by the British public's attitude towards it that she didn't quite fully process, and that essentially she was someone who dared to remold life on her own terms and to take the steps that she wanted to live, yes, as a duchess and a member of the royal family, a member of a relation of the Windsors, but that she did not want to feel necessarily shackled by that. And in many ways, and this is where I think it gets even more historiographically complicated, the best evidence that we have now, decades and decades after the abdication crisis, there are letters that Anne Seba, who wrote a biography of Wallis, found from 1936, where Wallis is telling people she's very close to that she feels that Edward always wanted to get out of the monarchy and that actually she's sort of been used as the get-out ticket. So Meghan, in some ways, has been slotted into those two personality types, depending on which team you fall on. I tend to think culturally she's being made very similar to Wallis Simpson. I don't know if I buy that they're really that similar.